Okay, thank you, everyone. So yes, we are, as you can see, we are testing the hybrid format today. We have around 20 people on Zoom, and we have around 40 people in the room in Hong Kong right now. And as I said, this is the second session of Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered, which is Banu Cennetoğlu's artistic contribution to our exhibition Portal Stories and Other Journeys, currently on view at Tai Kwun Contemporary. So if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition yet, I really hope you can do it soon, and it's open through the 1st of August. And as I said, we as the Asia Art Archive team, together with Tai Kwun Contemporary, we are thrilled to co-present this project, which is a 3-day program and a publication that looks at the politics of posthumous archives. I just want to say a couple of words about the exhibition. And I can share with you that this exhibition is based on our team's research on the archive of the late Hong Kong artist Habik Chun. Habik Chun was a self-taught sculptor and printmaker who documented more than 5 decades of Hong Kong art history, covering over 3,500 exhibitions in the form of 3,500 exhibitions in Hong Kong in the form of photography and printed matter. So this archive for us, it offers this resource that can help us to write art history in Hong Kong in multiple ways. Coming back to Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered, Banu's project, we hosted Banu in Hong Kong in 2019, and her stay here was part of our residency program related to the Habik Chun archive. Banu's work deals with the production, representation, and distribution of knowledge, and our conversation in Hong Kong also focused on artistic legacy, an extension of the questions that she's been asking in her practice. So our questions were, how do we shape an artist's legacy? How do we control it? And how do we participate in it? As I said, these questions have been foundational for Banu's practice, Banu's artistic practice, and also Asia Art Archive team, who has been working with artist archives. And later we invited Banu to join this exhibition, Portal Stories and Other Journeys, and her proposal was to develop a series of public programs around these questions. So we started this talk series yesterday with a conversation between Banu, Michelle Wong, who is the curator of the exhibition, and myself. We talked about 2 posthumous archives that Banu and Michelle have been engaged with for several years now. So we discussed legacy, authorship, and formats of making these archives public. Before we start today's conversation with Jill and Banu, I also want to introduce another contributor to this project, which is a publication. This is the Orpheus Double Bind, a publication that we produced as part of Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered. And it features the English translation of an essay by Istanbul-based literary critic Nurdan Gürbilek. In our essay, Gürbilek writes about the author's dilemma, how the author believes in and also doubts their own authority to recover the lost and to speak for the silent. And in the chat box right now, if you are on Zoom, we are sharing a link to the PDF version of the publication. And for those of you in the room, we also brought some hard copies if you are interested in getting them after the talk. So today, the second one, the second conversation in the series, it follows the screening of the proposal, a 2018 film by Jill Magid, who's joining us for this conversation. I hope you had a chance to see the proposal. Those of us in the room, we definitely saw it. But if you're on Zoom and if you haven't had a chance to see the film yet, we shared the online streaming link in the confirmation email, and it's still available for 2 more days. But very briefly, this documentary is about the contested legacy of the late Mexican architect Luis Barragán, who passed away in 1988. His professional archive was made inaccessible when it was acquired by the chairman of a Swiss corporation in 1995. And for this project, Jill Magid develops a proposition in the form of an artwork, and she provokes us to think about this question: who's permitted to tell an artist's story? So before we start, I'd like to thank our partners and sponsors as well. So thank you so much, Tai Kwun Contemporary, for co-presenting this project, especially Tobias Berger, Daniel Ho, Veronica Wang, David Chan, and Kylie Tung for making this event possible. And I would like to thank Hong Kong Arts Development Council, the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charities Trust, and Wing Foundation for supporting the Habik Chun Archive project in the previous years, and China Cam Group for supporting the research for this exhibition. In terms of the format, we'll have this conversation for about an hour, then we'll open the floor for your questions and comments. So please feel free to use Zoom's Q&A tool anytime during the conversation. And if you're with me at JC Cube, we will have a roving microphone for your questions in the end. I also want to add that we are offering simultaneous interpretation from English to Cantonese. So if you would like to follow the conversation in Cantonese, you can click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select Chinese as your language. And if you're joining us here, we also have some SI devices just outside the entrance. And maybe I can also say that Banu and I, we will moderate this conversation tonight together. And Jill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, shall we start?
Let's do it, Banu.
Okay. Do you hear me? Is everything okay? Am I going? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Özge. Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you, everyone. To make this program possible. We've been trying to structure it for almost 2 years now, since my visit to Hong Kong, right? So it's really kind of, I'm excited and also really grateful to everyone involved. Thank you. Jill. Yes. So I mean, I was thinking like, okay, to make a kind of really a proper and a beautiful introduction, for our friendship, as well as for our kind of continuous, the conversation over the years, with different frequency from different geographies. And I mean, first of all, thank you so much to be here and to, be part of it. Jill and I, we kind of, I mean, not kind of, but we know each other since a while. I mean, if I kind of make the numbers explicit, maybe I shouldn't. But I mean, it's crazy. It's been like 17, 18 years that, we know each other, and we were in Amsterdam living and working under the same roof and discussing and dipping our biscuits to the wine, when I think of you, and discussing a lot of questions and worries and excitement. So I really want to go back. I mean, I'm not going to read your impressive and amazing bio. People can, find very easily, and from the guidebook as well. But I want to go really to the beginning of this, your interest and your daring and very contested interest with the body politics, right? And before really come to Barragán and like that kind of your proposal or your suggested transformation, actually I want to really say a few words about your previous work, about like, how your relationship with this transformation or with this capacity of being the body and, becoming another body, and eventually, without a kind of uncontrollable journey started with you, because it didn't start with Barragán, right? So it started actually with your own body. And so when we were together 17 years ago, young and restless, I will say, which we still are, but idea of conversion, that idea of transformation, that idea of actually asking different questions during this kind of transition, right? It started, and it was about your body, which we will never see actually during your lifetime. So that work already triggered a lot of questions about authorship and legacy and posthumous. Allows a lot of things not to be seen, right? And also it's a big screen production, and so there are lots of different opinions and worries and concerns, and also somehow profits in a kind of positive way that were probably considered to make this work, right? Like, so it was involving different parties and different negotiations. So today I really want to kind of converse with you about, like, also which I share this, you know, the similar questions and worries about our position as artists, or sometimes as narrators or as moderators, the self-appointed positions, right? So somehow we adopt this position. We wanna, with our works, somehow we wanna bring certain kind of justice, right? This justice is a very, you know, I'm using it in a very general way, to some unjust or unjust context. But of course, if I want to, of course, refer now to Orpheus, also to the book of Nurdan Gürbilek that we shared, okay, you also read, you know, during this period. I want to go back to this Orphic gaze. I want to go back a little bit to this kind of effort at resurrection, or a gaze of redemption, or a gaze to try to fix something, right? And then, and my question, my kind of continuous question is about, what about if this gaze is equally contested and is equally unjust for the absent one and for the silent one? And if maybe, because we assume that everyone knows the Orpheus, who is Orpheus, you know, and what was his intention really. So if you allow me, before I kind of formulate the question in a shorter version, I want to read very briefly, like, actually about the Orpheus. The Orpheus of Greek mythology descends to the land of the dead in order to bring back his wife Eurydice, who died when she was bitten by a snake. He's permitted to descend to the land of the dead because the melodies he plays on his lyre have softened the heart of Hades, the god of underworld. But the gods have one condition. In order for him to be able to save Eurydice, he must not turn to look behind him. Orpheus in the lead, with Eurydice behind, they're just about to set foot on the face of the earth when Orpheus looks behind him to see if Eurydice is there. He loses her for the second time, forever. So from this, I can really jump to the Orpheus gaze. The way the Maurice Blanchot kind of articulates this, says, is actually maybe this relationship is not about the Orpheus and Eurydice, but it's about the writer and his muse. Blanchot says, writing begins with a violation of a rule, with Orpheus' gaze. Orpheus looks back because he wants to transcend the threshold of death and see Eurydice in all her invisibility, to give form to her dark obscurity. This desire the writer feels for the darkness of the other is at once the writer's source of inspiration and his destructive act. Orpheus loses Eurydice a second time because he wants to bring her back, wants to give form to her absence. But what makes the work possible in all its obscurity is the gaze that wants to give form to absence. What do you think of that?
That's a big question. I think I'm going to answer like a slice of it, because I think it's very big. But I think in my own work overall, you know, and I think with a lot of people's work, it's of course this absence and that, you know, the in-between space, or that which you can't articulate or you can't know. Hold on, take myself off. It is that void that we walk into, right? If the answer or the form or something is already there, I don't think you have that need to understand it in the same way. So I'm drawn to the voids and the absences of what we can't see. Not all absences and voids, but you know, that's where the question or a question lies. And I'm looking for, in all my work, I'm interested in these systems or how things work. But one of the most important things to me is to find the question, you know, the main question that leads to other questions. So I think I really liked the line in the text you're referring that was talking about Mallarmé. And I don't have the text right in front of me, but I wrote a little bit of notes where it says that literature begins when it's transformed into a question, thus a problematic of literature. And Mallarmé asks himself, does something like literature exist? This question is literature itself. So I think it's this in this looking back, it's like, metaphorically, are you looking back at your DJ, or are you looking back at the void that your DJ has left, and how to kind of describe that void? You know, are you resurrecting the woman, or are you resurrecting your relationship to that woman? You know, I think it's really important to figure out exactly what is attempted to be resurrected, you know. And another thing in the text was this continual return to an awareness of failure. You know, that when you're writing or you're creating something out of the void, what is the success of that? That you bring it back? No. You know, it's like a feeling of it, or in a series of important questions that arise because of that void. So that's the space that I find myself, like, even in the film, or not even in the film, but clearly in the film, I believe it was important to me in the film. You know, I'm not trying to even make a film about Barragán. It's not directly about Barragán. And I think, you know, some people who go to see the film and want a documentary on Barragán and his work may be frustrated by that. I do believe that for me, one way to respect his work was to try to film it in a way that the full feeling of the work that it produced in me, that I brought to the film. And I wanted Barragán to feel like a ghost. So you were super aware of his absence. The same, I would say, for Federica. I mean, not in the same way, but she's also absent. And her voice is given voice through a voice that's clearly not hers. So in ways I try to point to that absence, but at the same time carry through a feeling of the work. I'm not sure if I answered you as directly, but that's like some of it, of what.
Well, I guess that maybe in your approach, there is no tension, or there is no conflict in terms of, or you're interested actually that the Barragán becomes almost a subject matter for you, for your work, and which is, when you said, right, it's not about Barragán. Somehow there is no, you're fine with this relationship, that Barragán can be a content for a piece of yours, and then hence disseminated to the I mean, art world, to the market, to the consumption, or anything. I mean, the whole art world is, you know, as we know, has different structures. So
no, I mean, it's not that simple. The piece that, Banu, you brought up in the beginning is called Auto Portrait Pending. It's a piece I made in 2005. I created it when I first learned about this process that certain companies do, where they take the carbon from human remains and they grow from that carbon a diamond. It's actually the exact same carbon. I think this is a very important, beautiful metaphor in relation to this, that a scientist was explaining to me. It's not even that the diamond like grows from the carbon, it's that the molecular composition of the carbon from the body just realigns itself as a diamond. So they are the same exact thing, just in another form. I think that's quite interesting. But when I made the proposition to make myself into a diamond after I died, that raised a lot of questions for me, spiritually, religious-wise, how I felt about being something, my body transforming into a sellable object. Because for me, that was important, the collapse between the body of the artist and the market, like how people say, I own a de Kooning. It's more about the identity of the maker than the object that he made. And in that work, I was very interested in the market relationship between the artist's body and his or her, their work. The Barragán situation is more complicated in that there were multiple institutions involved in the struggle over that legacy. You have Barragán himself, who created these two archives with helps of others. And, you know, there's all these stories of what was burned, what was kept, you know, so it's already, the archive is incomplete and spread out and fictitious. But I struggled throughout the whole project of the ideas of representation and what was my role in that. And that wasn't like that question was like done, was asked and solved. It was each, I kept asking that question before the idea of the proposal came. I did 2 years of work on Barragán, and what I was interested in was that this Swiss company that bought the rights to his work and the rights to his name, trademarked his name without the accent, which I think is quite significant in terms of identity and origin. I wanted to understand what treating Barragán's work as property, as commodity, because that's what it was being treated as, how that affected his legacy, right? So it was, I'm stepping into a territory that's already, his work is property, right? And his identity is a form of property. So you have these dueling levels of Barragán the man, who I never knew, and neither did the Swiss company. And then you have Barragán's work as the architecture. Then you have his archive that's now owned, and the architecture that isn't owned, but any reproduction of it is owned. So at each of those junctures, I'm constantly struggling with how is it being represented or not being represented without me? And then what does my questioning and participation do as well? And there's a line in the film when, right when I'm thinking of the idea of the proposal, you have the shadows flickering on the shadow wall in the park. And I say, I understand that I'm entering a story that has not previously included me. And that by entering that story, not only may I affect its future, but also a retelling of its past. And that for me is that critical moment. And it was super important for me to let the audience know that I'm aware of the complexity of what is happening here. And again, that's not an excuse. That doesn't then give permission. It's a struggle, you know, but I feel a responsibility for my work, and I came to the ethical conclusions that the questions were really important. And so I asked them, but I also, yes, treat it as subject matter too. I also, like Malamar was saying about literature itself, like I cared about the cinematic form. And I wanted the story to make sense and be beautifully told and cinematically so. So there is that, you know, tension.
Of course, I think this tension is, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and also I know also, you know, your care about, you know, like somehow these are really unanswerable questions, yet doesn't mean that we have to normalize them, right? That's what I, so, and that requires like a constant maybe re-articulation and re-questioning, and also different solutions for maybe each iteration or for maybe each encounter. It's not like it's done and the work is kind of, closed and then we move on, but it's a kind of a continuous relationship, especially, I mean, you work so many years, it becomes part of your life, it's not just a piece of art that is kind of, you put there out there and then, it has its own journey. So, but at the same time, when we kind of make these people or those archives or these situations too much part of our lives, sometimes also it creates a kind of almost a wall or an obstacle to be accessible by the audience, right? It becomes our history, it becomes our conflict, it becomes our thing that the more like a general public or audience that doesn't find an opening for their own transformation or for their own questioning. That's also the problem in general with art, with self-referentiality in it. And so in that sense, it's important also maybe to let the vulnerabilities, right, to be perceived by the audience, and not everything is kind of, good or bad. This is done and undone, And I think we were talking also, with Özge, a lot about how sometimes you make yourself very vulnerable, when you're in a part of a system, and you trying to raise a lot of questions about, emotions that normally that kind of approach maybe to such an archive wouldn't be appropriate, Özge, yeah.
Yeah, I was also wanted to mention that point as well, because Jill, what's striking about how you approach the issue of ownership and the control archives is that you're bringing this idea or sense of love and emotion into the discussion. Even the film itself, it starts with your letter to Federica Zanco, the architectural historian who runs the Barragán Foundation. And throughout the film, the tone of the letter changes, and it becomes much more friendly and much more intimate throughout the process. And we were discussing again with Banu and saying that this is something curious, because especially, for instance, in my experience at Asia Arts Archive, we approach archives as resources in the first place. We approach them as scholars, as curators, as artists, and we don't necessarily talk about emotional connections. But it's also important that we don't own any of these archives. We digitize them, we make them available on the website, we don't hold physical copies, so we want to act as like custodians or almost like a facilitator. And when we were watching your film several times in the last couple of months, we were saying that in the proposal, the ring with Barragán's ashes, which you proposed to Federica with, it generates a reading about emotions and love and possession, maybe, eventually. But also at the same time, the proposal remains a legal agreement. So if you could say a little bit about how you actually negotiate between these two things, the emotional and the legal, that seem different things, but maybe they are more of an intersection as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One thing I would say right at the beginning of what Banu said really struck me, this kind of difference between like an academic approach, let's say, or Özge, like you said, a custodial approach, but those are quite different. Actually, one is like making something available. I mean, every time you touch something, you're having an effect, but let's just say like on a sliding scale, just making the archive as accessible as possible, that's a like custodian position. I'm sorry, I hate when I'm big because it's so confusing to talk to myself. So that's one position, but then I think there's a real myth of an academic approach that's like, you know, that was the approach of the Barragán Foundation, is this very academic approach. And the one orange book that you see over and over again in the film, which is the main book that they did. And I'm not criticizing the book, you know, it's not my intention. It's just, it is very academic. The essays are very academic. When you go to Barragán's work, it's not, for me, and I don't think for many people, the academics of the work that is what is most pronounced. And if you read anything Barragán also wrote, which is another thing, because it's not the same as the work, what he wrote about the work or said about the work is not the work, just like any of us, right? But the way he talks about an emotional architecture and the feeling that he's trying to create, and if you pass through Casa Barragán or any of his works, this kind of narrative feeling that you get is totally a quality of the work. So, and that's something I tried to make clear in the film, that like I don't believe that they're in a solely academic approach to Barragán's work is going to meet the work where it is. And I believe that you need to have many other perspectives, one of which is a kind of visceral experience of the work, which is something that through my own work I try to tap into. Again, it's my visceral experience with the work that I'm trying to bring to the screen, inspired by Barragán's work. In terms of like the way I approach work in general, Cuauhtemoc Medina is a Mexican curator who's in the film as well. And he jokingly, ages ago when I first met him in 2004 when I made Evidence Locker, which is a piece in which I was followed by the Liverpool Police Department through their surveillance cameras, and also kind of made an intimate relationship with them through this very bureaucratic system that is anything but romantic, until I injected myself into it and it became a tool of romance. But he called me a romantic conceptualist, and I kind of love that term. And I think, you know, for me, as I said to you, when I'm studying a system and I'm trying to understand it, if I don't find a way to kind of connect with it on a real human level, and when I say human level, that brings in intellect and also emotion, I don't feel as invested in the questions. So there is a kind of like need to really bring it into myself and see it on this very human, messy level. And I bring that into the work. And I recognize that while that has the benefits of, I think, helping maybe an audience connect, because I know it helps me connect, you know, it also makes it messier, right? Because there's this myth of like, not messiness when it's academic, but I also think that's a kind of violence, you know, too, that Banu and I were talking about violence and like entering things, but academia has this kind of like false non-violence. I think that emotion, it's easier to see, oh, you're getting involved, but academia is getting involved too. So I don't know, maybe I'm digressing, but for me, getting vulnerable and putting myself inside the system so that I can feel it and feel my own struggle within it and trying to express that struggle as part of the work is like my own way of understanding the system and trying to reconcile with it. And also something I put out there, and I accept the messiness, and I realize it doesn't always make me look good, you know, but like that's part of it. It's like good writing is honest writing, I believe. And I say honest in that like you feel its truth when you're putting it out there, not the overall truth, but your own truth in relationship to it.
Özge, do you want to comment to it?
I mean, we can actually go back to the reactions that the work received in Mexico City, because Julie mentioned your connection and your discussions with Cuauhtemoc Medina. Perhaps we can continue with that, because towards the end of the film, you shared that when you brought the work to Mexico City, to the University Museum of Contemporary Art, MUAC, you received a lot of responses, and the museum organized these series of public depicts. And there were some people who called the project grotesque, some of them called it shameful, some of them called it even barbaric. And I also remember reading that at some point it was the curator himself, the chief curator of the museum, who said that there is this aesthetic unease about the project, but somehow it's turning into a longing for a moral authority. And this basically really moved away perhaps from what you really wanted to talk about, which was really about access and control of the archive, but it was really about, we were back to the artist's body itself. So we've been thinking about this relation between the body of work and the artist's body, and how these conversations got stuck only at one point. So it would be great how you dealt with these
also just
and
can I add just one sentence to it, because it's a body of work, artist's body. I think I like to use it in plural. It's not only Barragán's body. Your body is very, very, very present in the film in a very unusual, kind of, we are watching you. It's very consciously and conceptually shot. We see you on the shower. We see you nail polishing. There are things normally, it's very interesting also cuts for me, so I think it's great if you receive this question as a whole. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so I'll try to because those were all very conscious decisions, obviously. Yeah. So I always big again when I speak. Hold on. Okay, so so two things. Firstly, I think to go just back to before I hit on the body directly, to go back to the response to the work. So I believe that responses to work, if they're multi-layered, it's not just the initial knee-jerk response to a work. I was taught by the best art teachers I ever had that if you go to see a show and the work bothers you, go again and again and again. And a lot of times that I find that the work that really bothers me or angers me is the work that has affected me the most. And I'm not talking about a cheap one-liner, I'm not talking about work that's meant to provoke for provocation's sake. I don't like that work at all. I like work that I have to stop myself and be like, why is this bothering me? What are the questions that I'm struggling with here? And I'll give an example, just, that's not my own work, that a work that really bothered me. But I've always loved Santiago Sierra's work. And then I went to, I heard actually on NPR, this was years ago, he had made a work in Germany where he took an old synagogue where most of the Jewish population had died in the camps. And it was an abandoned synagogue, and he filled it with the gas that, I don't know if you guys know this piece, but he filled it with the gas that was used in the camps to exterminate the Jews. And the German people who wanted to go see it, or anyone who wanted to go see it, had to line up and one by one put on a gas mask to enter this synagogue. And there was this debate, and I was so mad at this work and so furious. And I still think about this work all the time, because I was like, is it because I'm Jewish and I identify with this work? And so suddenly all this very hardcore work he's making, I take super personally, and so I can't handle it. So I just want to bring up like a totally different, piece. And like, I go back to that work because I think it's very interesting to think of myself as the audience and like how I'm particular to that audience. So to go back to the proposals reaction, the rollout of it was quite interesting, because when I first showed the work in Switzerland, it got a lot of positive reviews. Like Freeze wrote about it, everything was good. It was the New Yorker article that came out almost a month and a half after that's when it set off the tensions in Mexico. So there was even some responses in Mexico before that. So it's very interesting, like, is it the work itself that set it off? Was it the way it was described in the New Yorker? Like, what was it? And we don't have the time here, but I actually like tried to really trace where is the question coming from, And I think it's a complicated work, and it's the first part of like, some of the way it was written, it was that I like went in and dug up his grave and grabbed the ashes. Like, that's the way it was described, as opposed to like a 1.5 year negotiation with the government, with people I was working with the family, how much of the ashes was going to be taken. So that kind of provocative thing of taking ash and turning it into a diamond, yes, that is like the physical thing. And so there was a lot of conversation on that. But what I saw that was happening, especially, let's say, in the debate that I found really amazing, it was a 2-hour live debate. And the way it was set up is there was like teams, it was like those against the project and those for the project. And the whole first hour was like this attack on me, and on the people sitting next to me. Was this legal? What is this a problem with religion? Can you do this? And some of the responses were also like really fascinating, because let's stay with where you are. Okay, the diamond in the body, So some people were saying, okay, Barragán was Catholic and you shouldn't transform. And then one of the people on the team was like, well, what about relics? And there, apparently a few years before I made this, there was a ceremony at where all of the bodies at the rotunda where they're buried, where exhumations happened. There were multiple exhumations, and relics from various bodies were exhibited as a way to honor the dead. So there were these amazing conversations of like, what about the mummies that we're showing in the Archaeological Institute? Because they're not famous, are those not a problem? Like, what does it mean to show the body? What does it mean to transform the body? Whether it's the body itself, or, those beautiful boxes that relics are put in, or parts of body that are studded into jewels that you have in Roman Catholic churches, or just churches. I'm not sure if it's Roman Catholic, but so we say stuck, but there's a huge history of the body and how to memorialize the body, or the power of the body. And if I didn't believe that the body as well had meaning and resonance, I wouldn't have used body as material. It wouldn't have had meaning for me. But secondly, after that hour of all of those arguments, one of the people said, well, why didn't Mexico buy the archive? And then you had a representative from MUAC said, we tried to. It was too expensive. And then they started arguing amongst themselves about the way archives in Mexico are treated. And the whole last hour, for much of it, I didn't have to say anything. And they argued amongst themselves and tried to decide, like, you know, there's also a lot of anger that I'm American. You know, this was the Trump in his ascent, like, I'm a woman, I'm American. Like, this whole history started coming up, you know, obviously, or not, I hope obviously from the film, I collaborated with a lot of Mexican partners, but like, it's complicated, you know? And so the larger questions I was asking, which I think the body is also a large question, and I think it's important. But other questions, let's say, of equal importance to the legacy of, like, why don't we have this work? Or how should we make it accessible? How should it be treated? That's what they started arguing. And so in that way, like, the questions were raised and asked. It's just that sometimes things are, you know, you have to ruffle people's feathers and kind of piss them off. So, because I made work for 2 years before the proposal, and it got reviewed in Mexico. It was discussed, but it hadn't pushed anyone far enough to actually be like, wait a second here. What is happening with this archive? You know, so I think sometimes you have to ask a question in a really hard way before people are kind of like forced to discuss it.
But also, I think for me, my question when I saw this work, or if I didn't know you, you know, I thought a lot about this, because if I didn't know you, if I didn't know your long practice, what would I think about this work? And I had a lot of issues, to be honest. I had a lot of problems, not maybe as the continuous engagement, but solely like to, you know, for the film, because I think the film has a very particular cut, and it's very easy to read in terms of this notion of violence that we were talking, right? Because in the film, going back to the work, Santiago's work, right? I think that the trigger in that work, for me, at least what I think, somehow he brings, he confronts the normal public for a catastrophe, which is not representable on a daily, the everyday basis. He creates a disruption on their daily routine of the normal, you know, general public. Because for a lot of people, this is an historical catastrophe. It happened, and there was a kind of confrontation, you know, and then it's somehow enclosed or seized in a kind of, you know, between two brackets. But somehow the fact that he was able to bring or create a platform where people, normal people, that they don't feel really necessarily in complicity with the catastrophe, right? Because they were not there, they were not the decision makers, but somehow he created that space that they could see themselves in on the mirror in terms of their own complicity. Because we are in complicity, right? It doesn't matter that it happened, you know, last century or 50 years ago. So I think in your case, maybe in the film, what I would love to see more, it's your more ambiguous position. Because somehow I feel like sometimes there is this mission that you, at least that's how we see you in the film, that you're trying to fix things. There was something wrong done, and you're creating an entity. It can create maybe a possibility of a displacement for this archive, which maybe at the beginning it shouldn't even leave its original space. So we don't see all your questions at all, actually. We see you as there, you know, as a super able, amazing, capable artist, woman, and she comes and tries to fix things. That's how I read, for example. And but when one has the chance to see the entirety of the work, the film, maybe your you know, the discussions, the debates, then we can think, you know, more actually what it is, right? And
yeah, I get that. I think okay, so I think, you know, as we one of your questions you posed to me in writing before coming was like the different, that my work exists in these different forms. So there's the installations and the exhibitions, some of which you see a piece of it towards the end with the proposal installation, which is different than the proposal film. You don't see the 2 years previous of work, which was one of the challenges in making the film, because my invitation by Laura Poitras came kind of deep into the process. So there's that copyright scene in which I'm kind of trying to collect those questions about what is copyright, and the relation, copyright or property is property. A thing is a thing, but property is a kind of relationship between people about a thing, right? And so, in the film, it's a different approach. So one thing I wanted to do is to make this film not an art film that just played in a gallery space. Okay, so there is a piece of it, the exhumation, which I show as, you know, more of a conceptual video art piece, let's say, that's one part among many in an installation. There's also always in the installation evidence of the letters between Federica and I, but I'm represented in that way by my own handwriting and my own writing. And a very interesting thing that the difference that I was learning between filmmaking, let's say, and an installation, besides the fact that you can control the timeline and how someone walks around and enters, is me, you know, as a character. Because in an installation, my body is not present, right? So no one walks into my installations and asks, who's the protagonist, right? Who's the bad guy? These are like cinematic questions that don't get applied in the same way. So when I started making the film, it was this, like, I had to really learn in this film, who am I? You know, again, kind of, because I'm the director, but I'm also in it, you know, there's my voice. So, and I tried editing the film with me in it more or less. And what I really came to find is that there was a kind of sweet spot that I feel I found that was using myself as a way to forge this path through these questions and through these stories. And I get how you could, you know, the reading of this able-bodied person going in. I feel that my way of using myself was because it was me that was posing the questions. And I didn't want to put the camera on Barragán, whatever that would mean. Like, that's a complicated thing to say. Obviously, it's on his house, and it goes back to this vulnerability question you asked, that, like, I lived in that house for a week. I constantly wrote when I was there. I directed Jared, my cinematographer, to film me in a way that I was kind of occupying his house. I was kind of standing in. And the way I wanted you to constantly see my body was to not forget that he was a body in that space, you know, and that house was made for his body. He actually constantly remade it to fit his proportions. Like, there's a picture you can't see in my little window here, but there's a picture that represents the film in which my hand is up and I'm touching the ceiling. And he designed that ceiling to just graze the top of his head as he walked through an archway. And it would, like, scare people who walked behind him that he was going to bump his head. He, like, played with that, with his body a lot. So I wanted to do that and use my body. And I wanted the questions, like the largest question of what does it mean for a corporation to own the rights to an artist's work, and how does that affect his legacy, and who can participate in it and who can't. And I chose that as the kind of through line of the question. And I know that the work is provocative, and it hopefully will create people to think hard in debate. So for me, because the way of questioning and how it came to be, and understanding these rights and how they were being owned and manipulated was so loaded, that including the controversy in it, that debate, and hearing all of, putting forward the negative things, was a way of enacting that debate. So I hear that you may have wanted more of that, but I felt in the way that I had made it, that those questions, and that my precarious position in it being so frontal, and that you're following me often, you often see me from behind, that I'm leading you on a particular journey that in the wake is leaving these questions for the audience. And it was also important to me that the film enacts the proposal, that it isn't some behind the scenes story of like how I made the work, because I had like interviewed actually quite a lot of people along the way. I have tons of footage of that. And I was like, you know, I'm going to leave the BBC documentary to someone else. Like, I wanted the cinema, the piece of cinema, to be as well an artwork. And so even, maybe this goes directly to what you were saying. In the debate, I raise a lot of these questions too. And but when I tried to put myself in the film debating, it was like you were seeing, it didn't work, you know, because I'm I'm playing a kind of role to enact the piece and raise the questions. And you can't then suddenly have, well, as an artist, you know what I mean? You can't, they're two different forms. And so I chose this form and let others raise the questions in it, so that the film itself is the kind of like the thrust.
Yeah, then it works. I can say definitely it raises a lot of questions, I think, for very different audience, for very different public, you know, public, like, because also, as you said, this is like a piece of work that normally people can go in an afternoon in a movie theater. They don't have to, right? They don't have to know your work. They don't have to know the contemporary art world. They don't have to know anything about your previous practice. It's just, you know, so then it's a totally different encounter, right? We were talking with Özge about how different public actually, by their interaction, make different works, right?
Yes.
And so that's somehow, I think, that also the capacity and the beauty of the cinema, in a way. It has to be self-contained. It has to self-sufficient, you know?
Yeah, but I think they're interesting. You know, I look at, I have to really continually keep educating myself of cinema, because it isn't, you know, I watched movies, but I was never this like cinephile, you know. It's something that comes later, and I see all these different forms and ways of asking questions, and I really was interested in this piece having a larger audience. Again, it isn't, you know, Jaws 2. I'm not getting like the random person off the street. It's still like a kind of niche space, but it is a much wider audience. And I really do, I mean, I wonder, Özge, if you have this kind of, you know, who's the audience for the archives you're putting, who are you inviting in? And I think that, like, I really believe in audiences, you know, like I hate books that don't trust their audience. I hate when like the author fills in too much, you know. I want there to be the questions remaining. I don't like tight endings and things like that. And so, you know, even when you're presenting something untouched, of course, you're creating a platform, and like, what is that? So there's just various levels. But yes, I think if you come to an exhibition versus the film, some of that openness you're talking about, you know, that questioning, you may feel in a different way than you would get from the film because of the nature of the piece.
And I think this is a great point to also open it up to the floor, because we've just watched the film in person in the auditorium, which is also very different from seeing it on my laptop, I have to say.
Totally.
And I'm wondering if you have any questions or immediate comments that you would like to share. We will have a roving mic around, or if you are on Zoom, you can also put your question or comment in the Q&A box. We do have a question. Thank you, Zaba.
Hi, can everyone hear me? So I had a question about Federica. Towards the end of the film, she writes back to you and she says that, you know, the stories are half truth, half fiction. I think something like that. I'm paraphrasing. But I was wondering if you agreed with that kind of summary of how she saw herself in the narrative of the film and your correspondences, and if so, if you agreed or disagreed when that tension became present in the process of making the film. Because what I found interesting is that we as the audience were also accessing her only through the archive of your correspondences, right? And then there was a moment where we think we're going to see her very clearly, but then you go inside the cafe and it's a very frustrating moment of not being able to access her, and she's the obstruction to the other archive that we cannot access. So I was wondering, yeah, how you approached this, what your thoughts were on her as a character, fictional or not.
Yes, thank you for your question. So the funny thing about that line is we all know how stories form, part truth, part speculation. That was actually, she was quoting me back. So my letter to her that I plan to, is this 4-page letter that I planned to sit down and read her this letter, and then Rolf was there and it was like kind of awkward, and I gave it to her instead. You know, I say in the letter, we all know how, I heard this story many times, but we all know how stories form, part truth, part speculation. But that even though these questions still remain. So when I think her letter to me back is brilliant. I thought all of her letters were pretty brilliant back to me. And just to be clear, although the film is 83 minutes, our correspondence was over 3 years, and she saw like at least one show in person along the way, and right from the beginning was interviewed by the New York Times. So it was very clear to both of us, well, obviously to me, but to her, that from the beginning, every letter was like becoming part of the work. And I'm extremely thankful to Federica because she didn't have to engage me, and she did, you know, throughout the entire process. But that letter, I won't speak for how she feels because I can't. But I think, yeah, all stories, all archives are part truth and part speculation, at least the approach to it, because no archive is complete, and you're always you're always looking through the lens of the archive itself and its like feeling of completion. But to go directly to your question of like her as a character, you know, the only access I could get to Federica was her letters. You know, I kept trying to see if I could go to the archive, and I wasn't allowed to go. So my relationship to her was through her writing, the book that she did, through anything I could find online. For the first 2 years, there was nothing online. It was crazy. I couldn't even find a picture of her. I mean, that's amazing in our day and age that I couldn't find a picture of the wife of the owner of Vitra, the director of a foundation. I had a private investigator. I couldn't find a picture of her. I mean, it's like, that's something, you know? So like, when finally there were pictures, you know, that was incredible. Also that she's blurred in my film, and that's because my lawyers said that to be safe, I should blur her. And so I had no problem. But then the weird thing is when she's on TV, I don't have to blur her. It's the same thing with my framing of the books. Once it's outside of me and someone else is putting it forward or publishing a book and she's in it, it's fair game. I find that, talk about the body. I think it's absolutely fascinating. The laws around that I can't represent her, but that once the news does, she can be represented. So I would say that she appears in the film very much how she appeared to me. Now, of course, that's also changed because it's not her voice reading the letters. It's, I found someone who I thought got the tension of the way the tension of her letters, that kind of a classy authority, but also this a little bit of an undercut, is what I felt. And I kind of enjoyed the fact that she remained this ghost in the film, because although she's alive and Barragán is dead, she did feel like a kind of fiction to me because of that's how, but she's also visible in the law, in her, not the law, in her use of the law. You know, the law exists. I'm sure there's laws whether you could like publish in a book a screenshot of this. You know, there's probably laws around that depending on countries, but like Banu Ojge and I are probably not going to like take you to court if you publish this as a poster, right? But like the Barragán Foundation is doing that. So these levels of representation, some I could control and some I couldn't. But I felt that the representation in the film worked for the piece of cinema, because I'm going to keep saying that because Banu's right to point that out, of that there is a violence in creating this kind of work. Like I am choosing to represent her. I'm choosing to show her. Like you can discuss that and agree or disagree. That is an ethical debate. But how she represented herself was another thing that I drew from.
I think, I mean, I have a lot of questions probably, but you have to go very
in 10
sharp
minutes.
in
Yeah,
10 minutes. Özge, maybe we can ask if there is some, from the audience, if there is any short question, or shall we wrap up?
Or I can try
Comes
to
with a
answer more
condition.
shortly. Yes, no.
Well, yeah.
There is one question here.
Short
and then
one.
we can wrap up after this. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much. I actually encountered the article in the New Yorker the first time, having lived in Basel, and you know, Vitra was like the backyard. So it's very interesting to think about, I mean, this private relationship, which turned into a kind of legal relationship, which is the underlining of the film in a way, in calling it even the proposal. But also very interestingly thinking about Vitra, the nature of Vitra as a corporation is based on copyright, right? The entire kind of franchising of Eames chairs and the miniatures, I mean, it's all about copyright. So the first thing they did, of course, I mean, the couple, whether it's corporation or the private, the patrons, there's kind of this blurring on the one hand, but a precision on the other hand. I'm just curious, I mean, if you would continue in this work, and if you see this you know, as a piece that hasn't ended, let's say, what, you know, I'm very curious because I feel like there's so many relationships then that are already set up through, you know, your past 5-10 years of work already in thinking about these relationships. So it's not really a question maybe, but yeah, a provocation.
Yeah, you know, I don't know if like work is ever done, right? Like the questions, they remain, and I say that in the piece, the questions remain. And I think, you know, what I believe a good work is that you can come back to it and maybe your feelings change or something happens in your life, you know, and your relationship to those questions change. I think that in terms of like the questions for me about copyright and ownership and property and possession, they've always been in me. You know, they rear their heads in different forms in every work. So whether or not even another piece I make is about Barragán directly, I'm still trying to struggle with those same questions, with my role, with something about the body that I find interesting, that this keeps coming up. If I look back over the course of my work, I'm very present in a project, and then the next one, it's like I go through this existential angst where I remove my body altogether. So after Barragán, I made this piece called Tender, and I just actually picture locked my film 2 nights ago on that. And I had filmed myself and I cut every single scene that I'm in out. I'm not in the film anymore. My presence was problematic, so I removed it. So I think that all these questions, they just keep getting regurgitated, you know, in these next works. I mean, if Federica accepts the offer or responds in any way, perhaps the piece continues. But right now, that very pregnant pause of there is a ring and it's asking a response, you know, it's a fetish, right? Like someone just told me that there, I can't remember which author said it, but that a fetish is an object, is a story masquerading as an object. I love that definition, you know. So the ring, it's a crystallization, pun intended, of like very challenging questions, and it's meant to explode them. And so I'm still like picking up the shards, and probably will be until after I'm dead, maybe. I mean, this about goes. So
I have a yes and no question, a very quick one. Would you sell the ring?
No, that it's right away. There's no, I forgot to say that because you brought that up. It's a quality of the work that you cannot sell the ring. So a museum can be the custodian of the proposal, but the ring itself, and it's in the contract with the family, and because the family also was like, we want you to propose, and if she says no, we want the ring. And I was like, no way. The ring is the question. It has to only be hers if she negotiates something with a museum in Mexico of how the archive could be accessible, you know, however they want to deal with that. And I'm not involved with that unless everyone wanted me to.
But then she can resell maybe. If she,
once she owns it, she can do whatever she wants with it. And I know you asked a yes or no question, but it's important that a body, like what you're saying with an archive, you cannot own a body. That comes from like post-slavery, and I can only speak for the West and like countries I've studied. I don't know what the laws are in every country, but in the United States and in Europe, you cannot own a body, but you are a custodian of a body. So the government's the custodian, or the family is the custodian. But once the body is transformed into an object, in this case a diamond, you can own it. So the ring, I originally was like, I don't want the ring to be owned by anybody. And the lawyers were like, you have to have it owned because otherwise you can't protect it and insure it. So we designed a system that it's equal ownership between the family and me, and neither of us can sell it, so that it's locked in this in-between space, unless she takes it, and then she can do whatever she wants with it. But by then, the archive has in some way been made accessible. And the ring doesn't have the same meaning.
No, but it's a probably a valuable art piece as well to sell.
I don't know. You can't. I'm a master at making myself unmarketable.
This is another session.
Speaking of suspense and anticipation, I think this is also a good moment to wrap up. Banu, do you have anything to end? Jill, thank you so much for this.
Thank
you so much. Thank you for, in the audience and everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just want to quickly add that tomorrow we will have the third and the last session of Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered. We'll screen Narcissist Organ Player, and we'll have philosopher Paul V. Preciado joining us for a conversation. There is a big team to thank, especially AA team and Tai Kwun Contemporary team. Thank you so much for your support, and we hope to see you soon. To be continued. Jill, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.